Hello, and welcome back to our series on learning Google Apps Script for HR, brought to you by Prairie-HR-Solutions, where we believe knowledge should be shared and in empowering our fellow HR professionals in really rethinking how we deliver our HR services and solutions by using tools that we probably already have at our disposal. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie-HR-Solutions, and in this video, I would like to pick up where we left off with our HR admin interface. And what we're doing right now is wanting to build out this update record function. Because up to this point right now, we have built in conditional if statements to where if a user selects create record, presses process, it's going to run a function. And if they use retrieve record, run a process, it's going to run another function. And we have yet to build out update record and delete record. What we have here instead is just an alert popping up stating update function coming soon. So let's build out that update function. And when we think about updating functions, especially in HR, we don't want to simply uh, overwrite data. What we want to do is collect the data that exists currently, save it into an archive or record of some sort for historical use, and then essentially replace that data with the new record. So it could be very easy to just go in here, find this, and then overwrite all this, and then delete this record, and that record just doesn't exist anymore. But that's not what we want. So I'm thinking about this operationally, and what it is that I want to have happen is I want to be able to come down here and retrieve a record, say 45, and then change that record and then resubmit it, find this record again, grab the information, move it over to another tab, maybe we'll call it archive, and then create a new record. So we already have, let's pick 45, or employee number 45. We already have the retrieve piece. So we don't need to touch that. What we want to do is say this individual we want to give a raise to, we'll do 146. And then we want the user to be able to go down here and hit update and then process. And then it goes through that all that other stuff that we just did. So let's first start out by creating a sheet that's going to receive this. And we'll just call it simply archive. And now what we need to do is we need to go back and grab all this information once we've updated the fields. Now we already have that in the form of our create record. So we're going to be able to use quite a bit of our previous code. Let's go over to our code and let's start working with it. So we have our conditional if statement, and here's our retrieve, and here is our update. So right now it gives this alert. We don't want it to give an alert. We want it to run a function. So let's call that function update info. Now this function doesn't exist, so we need to create it. So what we'll do is we'll go all the way down here to the end and create this function. Function update info. And initially what we wanted this function to do is just let us know that it's being called correctly. So for that we can do a simple alert. I am the update info function and I was called. Now this should let us know that when we hit that update, that it is correctly calling this function and it is producing this alert. So let's save this. And then we'll go back, refresh our user interface. Now when we select update record and press process, it should give us that alert, which it does. Good. So it is correctly being called. And what we want this function to do is to go through and grab the values of all these cells again. So we'll go back to our code and we remember that we did this in our pull info. Now we can use this and kind of send it over the same exact way, but I want to take the opportunity because we're not actually, the intent of this video series isn't to create a one and done HRIS or HCM. It's to introduce you to Google Apps Script and to provide you with code snippets for various situations and functions. So what I want to do is do the same thing as this pull info and just did a little different way. Perhaps this way was a little confusing. You're like, well, my gosh, we have these objects and we have, we got to do the properties of the objects, and it just didn't resonate with you. So what I want to do is provide you with a different way to do the same thing that you may find easier. And we can do that with our code here. Actually, let's leave that there because we can ensure that we're calling it and then it's running correctly. But what we can do is we can go up here and grab this piece to where we can grab it. We can grab the value. So what we'll do is we'll post that there. And what this is doing is it's getting the value of the employee number ID. And we want to store that in a variable. Now, instead of creating an object like we did up here, we are going to declare all the variables, and then we're going to declare another piece and then store that in a new variable. So what we'll do is we will say let imp num equal this. And what we can do is come up here and let's just grab the rest of this. And then we replace the record.lastname with let and a variable name. So let's do this and say this will be let last name. This will be let first name. And again, the reason I'm doing this is to give you a different method. Let division be that, and we'll say this is let job title. That's an easier way to do it, I suppose. We'll say let that equal that, and this will be let record notes, and this will be let record action equal that box. Good. So now we have all of these stored in an individual variable. Now, the reason I'm doing it this way is I know you've heard me talk about how different JavaScript and Google Apps Script handles dates. So when we were pushing our data, we did it over here on our server side. And we did it by grabbing, see, where's our record data? Here we go. We did it by this new date over here, and then we inserted it into this append row. If you look, we were only passing one parameter or one argument from our HTML side over here into this. This method and this time, we were actually going to pass two of them. And we're going to need this date and this user ID because we're not getting it from our HTML side. There's really no way to get the user ID and the actual timestamp here. We're going to have to get that a different way. So what we're going to do is get the timestamp from the HTML side and then the ID name from the Google Apps side, and then we're going to add that to our array. So we're going to be learning how to push information to an array in the front of the array or the back end. In this case, it's going to be the front, and we're going to teach a new method called unshift. So So let's go back to our HTML here. When we're working with JavaScript, we can actually use that new date method to grab the timestamp. And we can create that in a new variable. So we can just say current date equals new date. And this should work on all contemporary browsers. You may run into issues with it if you're, say, in Safari or another browser, but in Chrome, Internet Explorer, whatever, this new date does work as long as they have JavaScript authorized. And then this new date is, let me alert this out so I can show you what this new date actually produces. So let's save this, and then we'll go back and we will run this, because the way JavaScript thinks of dates is in milliseconds. And it is not terribly useful to think of a date, hours, and minutes and all that in milliseconds, because really there's no human that thinks in milliseconds. Oh, no, it is producing it in that way. Good. Okay, well, I stand corrected. But what we want to do anyway is let's just format this. We'll format this into our local English US, because if you have a global company, you'll realize that many companies actually put the year at the end, and various locales do it differently. So we want to make sure that this new date is formatted in a way that we are going to use inside of our script here. You notice that when we select this, or this sheet here, you notice that when we select this, we don't have Thursday and then the time. We just have simply this date. So let's go ahead and format it like that before we send it over to our Google Apps Script side. So to do that, we can create another variable and say formatted date. And let's make that equal to, and we're going to use a built-in method called new intl.date time format. And what that is going to require is for us to declare what format it is that we want. And we want it to be in English US. And then we want to format, and it's going to ask, well, what is it we want to format? And we want to format this new date, which we stored in this variable. So we can go in here and simply type in current date. Now what we can do is go in and give ourselves an alert and do that formatted date. And then to show you the difference, we can do an alert on that current date as well, so we can see, one, how it's coming across initially, and then what we did to change it and format it. So let's save this. And then let's go back to our sheet. Let's refresh our sidebar. Now when we update our record and hit process, we'll have that initial alert. And then we'll have the default version, which you can see Thursday, December 5th, 2024, gives the time, our time zone. Well, we don't want that because that's just a little bit too much. But what we can do is reformat it to this, which is the exact identical format of our sheet here. So good. And we stored that in a variable. So now we can create our new array to send over to our Google Apps Script side. So let's do that. Let's call this new data, because that's really what it is. And this new data is going to equal initially the formatted date, because we want that to be first. Although once we get it over to our Google Apps Script side, we're also going to have to add in, or essentially push, a new piece of data, which is that user ID in front of this. And then we want the imp, not period, comma. Then we want the imp number. Then we want the last name. Then we want the first name. And of course the division, job title. And then we want this salary. And this dough. And then the rec notes. And then we want the record action. So now we have a new array stored inside this variable that contains not only the field data, but also our formatted date. The one thing that we're missing initially is, remember when we run this update info, although we initially got to that info by doing the retrieve record, we still need to give this function the ability to know what this value is so it can do what we want to with it. So we can just copy this variable and add it down here. So now this function knows this employee number variable. Because remember, this function or this variable here isn't global. I guess we can make it that way, but that's fine. Now what we need to do is take all of this and send it over to our Google Apps Script side. So if you remember, we're going to do that by typing in Google Script run. And what we want to run is a function on our Google Apps Script side, which we haven't named, but let's name that update record, I guess. Yep, that'll work. And then this function is going to take two arguments. We're going to pass two things through this. The first thing we're going to need to pass through is this variable here, which is our employee number value. So we pass that. And this should look familiar because it's a lot like this. But what we're also going to do is we also need to pass this array variable through here. And to do that, we can separate the arguments by a comma. Now what's going to happen is it's going to run this, send this variable and this variable over to this function in Google Apps Script. And then what we're going to need to do is let's do another alert, letting us know that, and we'll have this alert run after this, I have sent over the data. Oops, make sure that's outside of it. And then what we're going to want to do is clear all of these out. So we can go up here and simply copy this and paste it here. And there we go. And then that will clear all the records. Because remember, we can clear this after it's sent because it's stored in these variables right here. Okay, so now we need to go over and create this function in our Google Apps Script side. And we can go all the way down here at the very end and create that function. So it is update record, passing these two parameters. And what we will do will just save this for now and go back to our sheet. Now we have our employee data sheet saved, but ultimately what we're wanting to do is grab this current record line after we find it using IndexOf, and then we want to, before we replace it or append it, we simply want to move it over here. So what we need is to grab this tab. And to do that, we need to create a variable. And let's have this variable called, let's just call it archive sheet. And what that variable is going to be equal to is our global variable, SS, which pulls us to our active sheet. And then we want to do essentially the same thing that we did here to identify our employee data sheet, except it's not going to be our employee data sheet. It is going to be our archive, but we can just copy this down and use that so we don't have to retype it. And instead of employee data, it's going to be archive. Now I want to go over here and ensure that I got the spelling correctly. Yes, I did. It's capital A. So now we have this archive sheet saved in this variable. Now what we can do is go through and begin grabbing our previous data. Now we can keep using the same thing, which is nice about having stuff already stored. So what we want to use is we want to use this snippet of code here because that's where we are storing the values from our entire employee data. So we want to use that. So since it's not a global, we have to retype this in here. And let's go ahead and give this a comment. And the comments, once we get done with our entire project, I will go through the script page, do the final code source, and then add necessary comments in here. But we'll just say this is existing data. And then what we're going to need to do is grab our employee number. Now, if you remember up here, we got our employee number on our retrieve data. We used this code right here. Now we could use this, and I think that's actually how I'm going to write it, because this is the same exact way. But for this snippet, let's go ahead and use this condensed version. And we'll retype that. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space here. Let's do let employee number equal, and what that's going to equal is our employee data, because remember our employee data is coming over as a 2D array, and we don't want a 2D array. What we want is to condense it down, and for that we use map, and that map is going to take a function, and that function is going to be the row, because that's what we're looking for. And then instead of the function, we're going to do our arrow function, and our row that we're trying to isolate is in that index number 2. Remember, indexes do 0, 1, 2. So we're really looking at this column here, and we're condensing that array down to only see these, because that's really what we're looking at. We're looking to search for an employee number through that array there. So let's make it 2. Then we have that, and we'll do a comment here. Let's say this is extract employee numbers from that 2D array into a 1D array. All right, perfect. So now we've isolated the employee numbers. Now what we need to do is search through that employee number and create essentially an index of this parameter right here. So just like we did with our retrieve data, you remember we created this employee index and then did this employee number index of. We still use this parameter. So really what we could do is simply grab this snippet right here. And this is why co-snippets are so helpful. Use that variable down here because remember we didn't use constant, we use let, so we can use it again. And this employee number is the index of that. And as you can see, when you highlight something, it shows when it's used in that function. So it's using this parameter, and this parameter is the employee number that we placed inside our form. So that's good. And I'll create a comment here, and we'll just say find index of the target employee number. Okay, so now remember, if it goes through our array here, our employee number array, and it finds it, it's going to return whatever index that number is at. If it doesn't, it's going to find -1. So we're going to need an if statement here. So we can go up here and essentially use our if statement here. But before we do that, there's one piece of information that our new data array that's coming over to us doesn't have. It has the date, but the one thing we didn't include in it is the user ID. So what we need to do is create the user ID. So let's create a new variable. Let's go and we'll just call this user email. And that user email is going to equal the session. And we want to get the active user. That's a method. And in this active user, we want to get the email. And let's store that in a variable there. And let's comment this out. Let's say this is get the user's email. There we go. Now what we want to do with this user email, before we even worry about indexing and finding it, we want to take this variable and include it in our new data. Our new data is, you remember right, we included our new data array is all of this. But what we want is to take that user and insert it in the beginning. So we want to add on to this array before we use it. And we can do that. We can take this and add it to the front. If you remember, the front is where we need it because our ID goes in the front of all of our array. And how we do that is by doing what's called an unshift method. So we can take our new data array and we can use the method unshift. And what we're putting inside that is this user email. Now what that's done is that took our array that we have sent over and it pushed the user email in that 0 index spot. So now what we're going to have to do is, since we're doing it this way, is we're going to have to do something slightly different because we're not adjusting. If you remember, we came up here and our record data, we sent this record over as an object. And then that object, we said, this essentially is the first column. This essentially is the second column, third column, on and on. What we're not doing down here is accounting for the header. And we're also not accounting for a zero-based because it is a zero-based index structure. What we're essentially doing is using this structure. So we need to account for that index structure. And to do that, we're going to have to create another variable to just kind of adjust it. So let's actually create our if statement now. And what we're wanting our if statement is to somewhat match this. So we're going to need this piece here because we use this variable. We want this to check to see if this index is greater than -1. Because if it doesn't find it, it's going to return back a -1. And then what we're going to want to do is first, let's declare a variable to take care of our header and to make sure that our data understands that it is working with a zero-based index instead of just our columns. So let's create a variable and let's call that variable row. Let's just call it row index for now. That'll be fine. And what this row index is going to do is we need to add 2 onto our employee number index here. Because right now this is not set up to take index. This is set up to take our data in the form of a typical array. So we need to adjust that. So what we're going to have to do is do employee num index. And then we simply need to add, not equal, what we simply need to do is add 2. And then I'll create a comment here. And what this is going to do is adjust for header. If you hit run and you're going through all of this and your data is adjusted awkwardly or pushed aside, this right here aligns it and it takes care of it. It takes care of not only the header, but also takes care of the header row, but it also adjusts the zero-based index structure. And now what we need to do, if it is greater than 1, if our if this employee index comes back and says, I found it, what do we want it to do? What we want it to do is copy the row that it found to the sheet with the tab archive. And to do this, we want to go to that sheet from that, get the range, essentially get the range of, if we used 45, we want to go to this sheet, this row, and get this range. But we can't just go down and say we got to hit number 17 because that row may change. If we were isolating 15, we would need row 15. So we can't use a static number here, but we already have where this row is located. And where that row is located is in our row index. That's why we adjusted the header. Because if you remember, we came up here and did -1 to adjust that header. We accommodated that header, and we also ensured that it is now zero-based, so we could use this row index. So instead of a row, we are going to use whatever row index we're at. And then our starting point is going to be whatever the row index is, the first column. And then we don't want, if you remember right, the next piece is going to need how many rows we're going over. And we're not wanting to go more than one. We only need one row for this because we're working on pulling that and copying it. And then what we're going to do is go over, and instead of counting how many columns we need, we can actually go over and simply use what we did up here, this sheet get last column, because that will cover how many columns that we actually have. And then from this, we want to get our values. Now this is going to come over to us in the form of an array. If you remember correctly, it's going to be a two-dimensional array, which is fine. But what we want to do is store this in a variable, and we'll store this in, let's just call this row data. We'll store this in a variable so we can use this variable to actually populate. We could go through and actually change this down, but instead we'll just store it in a variable and then call the 0 index of it. So now we have that. And what we want to do with this row data is we want to go over to this archive and essentially append a row. And append will just add on to the last row there. So what we want to do after we declare that variable is we want to use that variable to append it in our archive sheet. And then we want to append the row just like we did up here in our record data. Because if we just copied this, we wouldn't append the row to our archive sheet. We would append it to our sheet. And we don't want that. We want to append it to our archive sheet. And the row that we want, what we want to append is this variable, the data that's contained in this. But remember, this is a two-dimensional array. And to get to the piece that we need, we don't need to condense it down to a one-dimensional array. We can simply just use the 0 index because we covered that. And then what that'll do is that will take that data and archive it. So this method and this snippet here can come in handy if this piece here was confusing or it just didn't resonate with you. This is just another way of doing it. So now that we've moved this data over to our sheet, now we can actually go through and append our current sheet with our new data. Now we don't have to create a new variable for this because all we did was took this parameter and added to it. So we updated it. So it's already updated. So now when we actually go in and use this data, it will automatically contain this user email. So now we've taken care of the moving it over to the archive. So now we can actually append and update our row. So what we want to do is type in sheet.getRange again. And this range is going to be our row index. Because now what we're going to do is we've copied this data. So now we can go in and replace this data. And we can replace the data by setting a new value. We essentially just set values and then we can overwrite it. So we'll go back here and we need to start at our row index just like here. And we are only going to use one row, but we need to start at the first column. And we're going to go down till we hit our row index, which is this. And we are only going down one row. We don't need to go any more rows. But when we hit our columns, what we want to do is we could just use this piece, but I want to show you a method to where you can, instead of going to the last column of the sheet, you can go to the last length of the data that you have. So although we can do it this way, another method that you can do is by going into your new data, because remember our new data is now one more because of this user email, and then you can hit type length. And what this length does is it searches through this array and finds how many elements are in that array. And that's how much we want to go over in our columns. That's the length of the columns that we want to go down. We want to make sure that our new array fits our columns. So we just go until that length stops. And then what we're wanting to do with all of this is to set the values of our array. Now remember, when we're setting the values of an array, we need to make it an array, which is with our square brackets, and we click new data in there. And what that does is that updates that row. Doesn't delete it, remove it, push it down. It just simply overwrites it. And I'll put essentially overwrites, there it is, overwrites that row located at the row index. Now, when we're talking about updating a record, this, at least to me, this is the most complex of the four functions that we're doing. And again, I wanted to show you this way so you would have another sample to go off of when you begin coding or creating your own solutions. So we have, that is what happens when we have something greater than one. And if not, we have to figure out what we want to do otherwise. And what I want to do otherwise is I want to press return. And let's just say employee number not found. Now, although we have return here, if we go back to our script, we're not receiving any data back. Remember, with this one up here, our retrieve record, we were sending the code to our retrieved data, and then we were waiting on something back so we can then run this function to populate. In our case, currently, we're not sending or waiting for anything to come back, but we will, because it would be nice to go in and have the user get some sort of verification that this actually worked. So to do that, what we can do is have our code built and set up to return something. So we can have this return this and populate it in an alert. So we'll have that. We'll just leave that there right now. And maybe what we can do is build this in here, build another return in here to notify that record has been updated. And then in the future, what we can do is when we finally do clean this up, we can have this populate in our alert, indicating to the user that something actually occurred. So now what we can do is we can go back, and if we did everything correctly, this should update our record. So let's refresh. Let's refresh it. Now let's pick on number 45 again. You'll notice that 45 doesn't have an ID. It happened prior, and it has not been saved over here. But what should happen is when we go over here and hit 45, we first need to retrieve the record. We hit process, and the record is retrieved. Now what we want to do is we want to change something in that record. So let's give this individual a raise. We'll give them 146, I think is the number that we used. So if this works correctly, this 146, after it gets done running, should replace this. And then our notes, we want to update record, increase salary. We'll just say that, increase salary. And then this whole line should go over to our archive and append the row, and then it will update with that information. So let's go ahead and try it. We're not retrieving the record, we're updating it. So we'll hit process. Yep, we still have those alerts, so we'll have to go through and get that. That's the first one. We should get another one. I've sent over the data. Now when we hit OK, it clears it out. You'll notice that it updated that. Updated record, increased salary. It changed it to update. And it also grabbed our ID. So now we have to ensure that this record went over to our archive correctly, and it did. You'll notice that there wasn't anything here initially, so it did grab it, but it didn't grab the user because it just wasn't there. And let's make sure that it went over the actual length, and it sure did. So what we can do here is give it a row above. Simply go over here, grab our, go over here and grab our row headers. Copy this and paste. And then we'll do one more just to make sure everything's good to go. Let's go ahead and update number 25. And we want to retrieve it first. There's a retrieve. Let's not make them a maintenance. Let's change their division to HR. This maintenance tech became an HR generalist. The date of hire stays the same, but we are updating record. And let's say this person got a slight bump here to 69. And we can say that this was done on 2/5/2024. Want to change this to update record. And let's look at number 25, make sure it works. HR generalist 69, change Prairie-HR-Solutions, and yep, there we go. Perfect. So it works. And the next thing that we're going to need to do is say an employee leaves and we need to delete the record from the current, but keep the archive. If you think about what it is that we just did, we can easily go through and create a function that does the same exact thing, except instead of overwriting it, it just grabs it and deletes that entire row. So that one will be short and quick. I'm going to end our video here. If you like what we are doing, please hit that subscribe button. And until next time, please take care.